Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council and the Scowcroft Center for Security, Strategy and Security. It's great to see somebody here today. I'm Mike Anderson with Saab, and we've produced this program for 10 years. We have a 10-year anniversary for the Commander Series. Had a good start of this year. We had General Dunford, the Chairman of Joint Chief of Staff, here a couple of weeks ago. We had Admiral Richardson, the Naval Chief of Operation, here a couple of months ago. And today we're very proud and honored to have Secretary of the Army, Mark Esper, here today. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. We have engaged with the Council for many years as we have worked diligently and hard to become an integral part of the U.S. defense industrial base. And one of the first customers was actually the Army for Saab on the ground combat weapons portfolio, the signature management side, and also on the radar side. So we're very proud of that as we have branched out to the Navy and more recently as well in the Air Force with the TX win on the trainer aircraft. And as you may have seen the announcement last week that we're building a factory in West Lafayette, Indiana, to produce the TX part, the Saab part, the TX in the U.S. So today we're a company that have contracts and business and support on all branches of the U.S. Armed Forces, which we're very proud of. And we think that this platform, the Commander Series, has been very helpful for us to understand the priorities of the commanders and senior decision makers in DoD, to have a dialogue on future priorities and challenges and how we as industry, academia, and government together can solve problems. So we're very pleased with the partnership with the Council and this program. So before I hand it off to Chris Skaluba, who's going to introduce the Secretary more in detail, I'd also like to introduce a special group that we have here today, the Saab Graduate Leadership Team. Please identify yourself. A group of young, very potential, good leaders for Saab. And we're very pleased to have you here this week. I myself come from a program like this, being identified in my mid-20s and had a good career with Saab, so I hope you have the same. So very welcome to you as well. So over to you, Chris.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. And thank you, Mike, for the introduction and for Saab North America's support of the Commander Series. As Michael noted, the Commander Series is the Atlantic Council's flagship speakers forum for senior military and defense leaders, providing an extensive platform to discuss current strategic issues, and we're delighted to be hosting this event today as part of that series. As Michael said, I'm Chris Skaluba. I'm the director of the Transatlantic Security Initiative here at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this public event, the Future of the Army and Great Power Competition, with Secretary of the Army, Mark Esper. Thank you all for joining us, and my sincere thanks to Secretary Esper and Vago Muradian for being here. I'd also like to welcome the Atlantic Council board members I see here today, and I see a couple of you in the audience. Since the Commander Series began in 2009, top military and defense leaders have come to the Council to help shape the security debate on America's role in the world. This year, we are proud to celebrate the 10th anniversary of this series, and we feel it's especially pertinent in the rapidly changing security environment which we now face. Here at the Atlantic Council, we remain very involved on issues of U.S. engagement and leadership in the world, with one of the core pillars of our work focused on how to navigate great power competition in the 21st century. In particular, our Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security focuses on sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address this challenge. The center seeks to honor General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security and support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners and mentorship of the next generation of leaders. And so I'm very glad to see your group from Saab is here today. As many of you know, the U.S. national security strategy and national defense strategies define the resurgence of great power competition as the greatest long-term challenge to U.S. interests in national security. Rising and revisionist near-peer competitors like Russia and China seek to accumulate power at America's expense and may imperil the diplomatic, economic, and military bonds that link the United States to its allies and partners. Chinese and Russian provocations threaten to displace U.S. from its role as the guarantor of international order and its underlying security architecture. Their actions seek to redefine international norms on terms more favorable to authoritarian systems and in ways that are directly contrary to U.S. values and interests. While Russian hybrid tactics and Chinese economic instruments demonstrate that this great power competition will involve a full spectrum of grand strategic tools, conventional military force remains an essential element of power and international security. Russian and Chinese anti-access and air denial capabilities threaten to counter U.S. armed forces and complicate combined operations with allies. Therefore, within this complicated security environment, it's imperative to reevaluate and adapt both U.S. capabilities and the operational concepts that guide their use in accordance with our broader strategic approach to great power competition. The U.S. Army and the broader joint force need to think carefully and strategically about U.S. force posture in order to guarantee the security of the United States and its allies and partners. We could not have a better guest today to discuss these issues than Secretary of the Army, Mark T. Esper. As the 23rd Secretary of the United States Army, Dr. Esper has statutory responsibility for all matters relating to the U.S. Army, including the recruitment, organization, training, equipping, and care of 1.4 million active duty, National Guard, Reserve soldiers, Department of the Army civilians, and their families. Before his role as Secretary of the Army, he had a distinguished career at the Raytheon Corporation. He also worked as the National Security Advisor for Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist. He held multiple senior positions in the Pentagon. And of course, he's a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, having served in the regular Army for over a decade. He also has a PhD in public policy from the George Washington University. Moderating our discussion today is the founder and editor of the Defense and Aerospace Report, Vago Muradian. For nearly 25 years, defense and aerospace leaders in both the public and private sector have relied on his reporting and editorial opinions on policy, strategy, innovation, and technology. Just a brief note for our reporters in the room that Secretary Esper will do a small gaggle at the end of the event, and so if the reporters can hold their questions so we can let the rest of the audience ask questions. Once again, I'd like to thank you all for being here and for what I know will be a captivating conversation on U.S. military strategy and great power competition. With that, please join me in welcoming to the stage Secretary Esper.
Well, good morning, everyone. How you doing? Good, okay. Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. Really appreciate your words. It's great to be back here at the Atlantic Council, and it's nice to see so many familiar faces out there in the crowd. I feel like I'm back home in some ways. Today, we are going to talk about the Army's role in an era of great power competition. Now, for over a year, we've been reorienting our focus from counterinsurgency operations, which have dominated the past 18 years for the United States Army, to high-intensity conflict against near-peer competitors. This is what the National Defense Strategy calls for, and there is very good reason for it. Why is that? Because, as we know, Russia and China continue to seek opportunities to expand their power and influence, often at the expense of other sovereign states. In places like Ukraine and the South China Sea, we see this happening in real time. To enable their geopolitical aspirations, Russia and China are rapidly modernizing their militaries and have been doing so for many years. Through investments in next-generation capabilities, they are attempting to counter many of our long-held advantages. Since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. military has maintained an unparalleled overmatch on the battlefield, but that gap has narrowed. Our Big Five systems that have dominated the battlefield for decades were developed and fielded when I first joined the Army in the 1980s. Now, against the Iraqi Army in 1991, they were unstoppable. Against the Russians and Chinese in 2030, they won't be enough. Our potential adversaries have developed a new approach to conflict. In the past, we've been able to build up combat power with relative impunity and then launch the attack at a time and place of our choosing. But today, Russia and China are aggressively developing formations and capabilities and weapon systems that deny us that long-held advantage. Their continued investment in technologies such as artificial intelligence, directed energy, and hypersonics looks to enable the development of new systems that surpass our aging legacy capabilities. The simple fact is this: we have put off modernization for far too long. The weapons and equipment we have developed in recent years were intended to encounter insurgents armed with rocket-propelled grenades, and IEDs. While this was much needed to support ongoing conflicts, it came at the expense of being ready for future high-intensity battles. We know from history that not preparing for war invites aggression, and that is a losing proposition. Far too much is changing in the world for the next war to be anything but significantly different from our recent experience. So the Army has been thinking long and hard about what that future might hold. Imagine that future for a moment. Cyber attacks on our networks and systems disrupt operations from home station through deployment and onto the front lines. Every attempt to issue orders to subordinates or to send reports to higher headquarters faces jamming and spoofing. Ironically, in an era when we are used to having data in the palm of our hands, Clausewitz's fog of war could be thicker than he ever imagined. Precision long-range fires will have the capability to strike accurately at great distances. There will be no secure forward operating bases to conduct maintenance, to stockpile supplies, or to refit soldiers. Ubiquitous sensors from micro drones that fit in the palm of your hand to satellites will be searching constantly, looking to acquire targets to enable a devastating military barrage. And enemy aircraft will contest our control of the airspace, a threat our soldiers have not faced since 1953. In this future environment, large, slow formations and stationary units are targets waiting to be destroyed. Mobility and speed will be the key to survival. Autonomous and optionally manned systems will play a critical role on the future battlefield, allowing us to engage enemy formations or move supplies around the battlefield with less risk at lower cost. This will be a fundamentally different environment than we have faced in the past. So, what is it going to take to be ready for all that? The Army has a vision that describes the force needed to prevail over great power competitors on future battlefields. General Milley and I released the Army vision last June, and everything we do is driving toward that goal. To get there, we are undergoing several bold changes in the way we do business. Things like developing a new generation of weapon systems and equipment, writing new warfighting doctrine, deploying units overseas for training events with no notice, and developing a market-based talent management personnel system. We're making great progress on each of these lines of effort, and I'd be happy to talk about these in more detail during our discussion. Now, as focused as the Army is on preparing for war, our primary goal, though, is to deter conflict and preserve the peace. To bolster conventional deterrence, the Army continues to deploy forces across our priority theaters, Europe and the Indo-Pacific. In Europe, we keep an Armored Brigade combat team on hill-to-toe deployments to train with our allies and partners across the region. This past March, just a couple months ago, we conducted a no-notice deployment of more than 1,500 soldiers from the 1st Armored Division. They drew equipment from our pre-positioned stocks and conducted 3 weeks of training in Poland. Next year, we will conduct a major division level exercise across Europe. It will be called Defender 2020. That will involve over 20,000 U.S. soldiers and 16 ally and partner nations. In the Indo-Pacific, we are increasing the duration of our very successful Pacific Pathways program. We are also continuing to experiment with our multi-domain task force and applying those lessons learned towards the deployment of MDO Doctrine, as we call it. And in 2021, we're planning to conduct a division-level defender exercise in the Pacific. Continued training with our allies and partners is a key component of the Army strategy and will help ensure we retain interoperability as we modernize the force. In order to accomplish all that we've set forth, the Army needs an on-time budget, and I fear that's at risk. 9 out of the last 10 years have started under a continuing resolution. The cumulative effect of this budget uncertainty has put us in a hole that we are still digging out of. Continuing resolutions, CRs as we call them, have a detrimental effect on unit readiness and disrupt our ability to modernize. A CR again this year would disrupt over 100 Army programs, to include new starts such as development of the next generation combat vehicle and the strategic long-range cannon, and production rate increases, for example, of UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters and several key munitions. Even worse would be a relapse back into sequestration. This would be catastrophic for the Army and for DoD. The readiness gains we've made over the past several years, For example, over a 55% improvement in our brigade combat team readiness since 2016 would be lost, and our modernization efforts would be halted. Training would be reduced to platoon level, combat training center rotations would be canceled, and the vital work done by our CFTs, our cross-functional teams, would be put on hold. I don't know a single person who thinks this would be a good idea. I don't. I spent quite a bit of time on the Hill, and from what I've seen, there is strong bipartisan support for the Army's reforms and for our budget and for doing both on time. To prepare the Army for the future that I've talked about, we've canceled, reduced, or delayed nearly 200 programs, several of which are legacy systems that have simply reached the end of their life or are not well suited for the future fight. In some cases, we had more than what we needed. In others, we could accomplish the task with something already in the inventory. And for a number of programs, we decided simply that the upgrades just weren't necessary. This entire effort, which took over 60 hours for me and the Chief of Staff and hundreds of hours for the Army staff, resulted in a reallocation of over $30 billion into the Army's 6 modernization priorities over the FIDEP. And as expected, we've seen some resistance. As many of you know, canceling a program is often harder than starting a new one. Those impacted start to voice parochial concerns, and they solicit the support of members of Congress. And in some cases, it's argued that the Army's priorities are simply misguided. They say we are making a tactical error, that their program is what is needed to win the next war. Now, I appreciate all that advice, I really do. However, when it comes to making the tough decisions about the future, the Army relies really on our general officers who've been paddle tested for decades and our exceptional civilians who have extensive experience and have studied and wargamed the future. And these professionals are motivated by nothing other than the intense desire to win the next war and to bring our soldiers home safely. At some point in the future, every single system we use today will become obsolete. And while the bias for defense companies is toward upgrading existing programs, the best way to build resilience into our industrial base is by adapting to the needs of the future and meeting us there. The Army's modernization has created tremendous opportunity for those firms who are willing to break from the past and look ahead. So I would ask for your assistance to help support the Army's message. Change is hard for any organization, especially one as big as the Army, but we must make the transition to the future. We must stay ahead of our adversaries, and we must do all we can to deter conflict and keep the peace. Over the past 18 months, I've had the opportunity to visit our wonderful soldiers all over the world. I've watched them trained at home station and at the combat training centers in both the United States and Europe. I've met with them on deployments to Iraq and Korea and Afghanistan, and I've seen them work alongside our NATO allies in Eastern Europe. When I'm here in D.C., Washington, D.C., I can't help but be reminded that the decisions we make here determine how well those soldiers who are out on the front lines today are prepared for the next battle, the next war. The American Army is the best in the world. We are prepared to deploy now and win if necessary. But combat is unforgiving, and nothing is for certain. The men and women who join this profession deserve the very best that we can provide them. And the American people deserve an Army that's organized and trained and equipped to fight and win the next war when our nation calls. So with that, I want to thank you, and I look forward to our discussion this morning.
Sir, thanks very much for joining us. It's always an honor to be at the council and see so many friends. Michael, Chris, thanks very much for that. A quick administrative note, as Chris mentioned, to reporters. We're going to have a gaggle up here, which means the audience, if you could please leave from the rear to allow reporters to surge to the front to rake the secretary over the coals, but in a nice Washington sort of a way. Great power competition is certainly the focus of everybody in the military establishment, and you and I have talked about this repeated times over the years. I want to start off with just getting your sense. What are the things that Russia and China are doing in particular, right? Because there are those who say that we're the near peer to them at this point, given some of their capabilities, particularly in anti-access area denial. And since you mentioned that, that triggered a question. What would you rank as the biggest things that keep you awake, whether from a Chinese standpoint or a Russian standpoint, that we need to get a lot better at?
Well, I think with regard to both China and Russia, we've seen them modernizing for many years now, putting great sums of money into research and investment at a time when we weren't, because we were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so if you look across the board right now, we see them professionalizing their militaries at the soldier level. We see them making investments in combat systems. So the Russians have deployed a new tank in the last several years, new air defense systems and other things. They're also doing research into much of the work we are as well, hypersonics and directed energy. And we've also seen both countries willing to employ forces to achieve near-term gains, if you will. So those are the things we focus on. The key for us is to maintain overmatch going forward, much as we've had the past several decades. Keeping that overmatch deters aggression and preserves the peace.
Let me ask you about the cultural transition, because folks compare this era to Vietnam, but it's actually different. Because in the Vietnam era, when folks were rotating out of Vietnam and then going back into Europe, the Army was still focused in a great power competition with leadership that had actually fought the greatest of great power wars, right? So everybody sort of understood the deterrent game, understood the importance of fighting in Southeast Asia, but also addressing the Russians and the Warsaw Pact, and to a lesser degree to China. How culturally, we have General Göransson here, the former Swedish Supreme Commander, and it's the cultural transition that's the big thing to get back into a great power mindset oftentimes, especially when folks have been focused on counterinsurgency or doing things in a very lean manner. Talk to us about, are there an older generation of leaders that you're drawing off of? Are there texts you guys are reading, or after actions or studies from the Cold War period? What are the myriad of techniques you're using to get people's heads fully into a game that folks have not really experienced for a long time, including even at the leadership level? Folks were very junior officers at the time.
Yeah, several good points there. I would say, first of all, there are many parallels between 1973 and today, if you will. In 1973, we were coming out of 10, 15 years of Vietnam. We weren't focused as much as we should have been on great power conflict. We were an army in transition, and we had some great leaders in 1973 who took a number of important actions. So at that time period, we began the Big Five programs. So there's an equipment modernization. It was focused on how do you beat the Soviet Union in the Fulda Gap in Germany, number one. Number two is we knew the personnel system conscription wouldn't hold up. So in 1973, we went to the all-volunteer force. So a personnel changeover. Doctrine changed. We went to and eventually developed what became known as Air-Land Battle Doctrine. It's a doctrine that came out when I became a platoon leader in 1986, coming out of the academy. And so we had also at that time had gone abroad and studied the tactics of our adversaries. We studied the Arab-Israeli conflicts and learned things, much like we're going to school and studying what the Russians are doing in Ukraine and what the Chinese are doing. So you had and we stood up new organizations at that time, TRADOC and FORSCOM. Army's doing the same thing. We stood up Army Futures Command, and we are reorganizing the Army to get more efficiency out of peace parts of it. And so you see a number of parallels there. And so that's why when I talk about what the Army's doing these days, I talk about a renaissance, much like we had back then. And much like in 1973, they didn't do it in 1 or 2 or 3 years. It took them a good 10 years, and some would argue even more. The Army that they thought about and built in the 70s is the Army that beat fairly handily the Iraqis in the Gulf War, my war. And so we are in this renaissance now. We are looking at everything. We're looking at a new personnel system. We've reorganized the Army. We've how we equip across our 6 modernization priorities. A new doctrine. We're training soldiers differently at basic training and at one station unit training. So all those things are in place. We're moving out on a number of fronts, but it won't happen in 1 or 2 years. It will take several years. It will take continued bipartisan support from Congress. It will take an ongoing partnership with the defense industry, and it will take continuing engagement with think tanks like the Atlantic Council and others who can help us think about the future to make sure we get it right. The vision that the Chief and I signed last June said 2028 is our target date, and that is our target date to be ready, to have our equipment initially rolling off and finding its way into the units, having our doctrine nailed down, our personnel system set, all those things ready. Doesn't mean we're not prepared to fight and win today. We are. We have to balance readiness and modernization, or we like to say readiness and future readiness. But all that is underway right now.
It's a tale of two armies in many respects, right? The Russia challenge is known that has a lot of close allies. There's proximity that's close. It's a theater we know. It's conducive, for example, to a wall of armor to try to slow somebody down. Asia is very different, and the Army has been thinking about this problem, and I know you're spending more bandwidth on this challenge right now. How the Army fights differently in Asia, where its role is not maybe as central, but still as strategically key. Dispersed theater, distances are very, very great. Talk to us about the latest thinking you're bringing to bear in solving the Asia challenge, which the Army has been working on for some time with sort of mixed results until this sort of big push you guys have been making.
Sure. Well, first thing I'd say is we're blessed with a great number of allies and partners in both theaters. Obviously in Europe, it's the NATO partners, and if you look to the Pacific, you've got Japan and Korea and Australia, and we can go on and on with a number of countries. So we're blessed with that, and that's I think that is an attribute that neither Russia nor China really has. And so we need to continue to strengthen those partnerships. We need to modernize together, and we need to build those capabilities, because when we fight as a coalition, we're far, far more likely to have success. But you're right, the conflicts may turn out differently given the nature of them. The Pacific is a vast area covered by a lot of water, but it depends on where the fight ends up. We talk about fighting in the first island chain or the second, but who knows where the first scrap, if it happens, and let's hope it doesn't, with the Chinese ends up. But when we think about it, we think about some of the Army's modernization priorities. So you think about number one for us, long-range precision fires. Critical to both the fight in Europe, but will also be particularly critical in the Asia-Pacific, where we can employ weapons that can engage at hundreds of miles, and in some cases over 1,000 miles using hypersonics, and really not only take care of what we need to do Army to Army, but really support the Navy and the Air Force. We can support the Air Force with long-range fires by suppressing enemy air defenses, by taking out enemy airfields, and with the Navy, the same thing. We can hold at bay SAM sites. We could also hold at bay an enemy's Navy to do that. So long-range precision fires. The Army, what we're building in terms of integrated air missile defense will be critical. We're building robust networks that will be able to handle the data, all the things that need to happen. And so there are a number of ways that we will play in different theaters. Both will be different in some ways, but similar in many more.
How do you respond to the accusation by some that the Army, every 10 years the Army wants to reinvent the Air Force and relitigate 1947? How do you respond to the question that some folks ask, which is, why would the Army need 1,000-mile artillery unless it wants to replace the Air Force?
We don't want to replace the Air Force. We have the best Air Force in the world. It's a close partnership. We have the best aircraft, the best pilots, and as I said, we haven't faced an air threat to soldiers on the ground since the Korean War. So the Army's not looking to bring the Air Force back in. But why do we need long-range cannons? Because the Russians and the Chinese are producing systems that can outrange us. And so you always want to get outside the adversary's punch. And one of the missions that we developed in air-land battle that will continue in multi-domain operations is the ability for the Army to help the Air Force by suppressing enemy air defenses at great ranges. If we can suppress enemy SAM sites, that gives the Air Force much more freedom to go up and clear the skies and then open up for them to do other things.
Let me ask, go to cyber and disinformation. The Russians have a very clever saying that the most important strategic terrain is the 6 inches between your ears. And almost everything that the Russians have been doing has been stay under direct war. China has been doing the same thing, right? There's a rally, if you exchange fire, the nation mobilizes, but you can undermine societies very effectively, whether through cyber means or disinformation means. Oftentimes, our senior leaders are chosen on their combat prowess, not necessarily their savvy in either of those two domains, which could actually be even more important than the kinetic space, or as important as the kinetic space. How do we have to train a new generation of leaders that don't look at cyber or disinformation or information warfare as stuff that smart guys on my staff do, that they're as conversant and comfortable in those theaters, because as Bob Neller, the Marine Corps Commandant, says, we have been at cyber war for the past decade. How do we train a new generation of leaders that are as good at cyber and disinformation and countering them as they are on their principal warfare specialties?
Sure. First of all, I'm not sure I agree with your premise that just because you're a battle-hardened leader coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and most of our officers have spent multiple tours there, that you don't understand the importance of information on the battlefield. These folks have been doing counterinsurgency, and arguably much of that is hearts and minds and reacting to what's happening in the press or the media or what the adversary is saying. And so I think in many ways they're very attuned to that. The difference, arguably, with the Russians and what the Chinese may do would be their use of social media, other means, additional means to carry those messages. And in some ways, the Russians have pioneered that, right, in Ukraine and elsewhere. So we do think a lot about that. We are training officers in our schoolhouses to think about how you control information on the battlefield. Obviously, multi-domain operations includes, of the 5 domains, includes cyber. We are building capabilities at the brigade, the division, and corps level, where we're putting in cyber and EW capabilities into each, and we're beginning to test those now. In fact, if you were to go to the NTC, the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, and go through an exercise with one of our units, they are immediately and continuously confronted with information operations and electronic warfare. So it's something we're training now. We got to stay on top of it, because that will be what happens short of war and during war. And it's important that we understand that. So it's something we're working hard on.
And I wasn't trying to suggest that folks don't, because you're absolutely right. In a counterinsurgency environment, the perception is as important as the reality in terms
Sure.
of what you have to materially deal with. But if we look at some of our closest allies, they're concerned about Russia's military capability, but even more concerned about the information space and how it can be manipulated and how much worse it can be in a couple of years. Do you think that senior leadership has a good understanding of that space now?
Yes, I think we do. I mean, we're obviously aware of what's happening out there, and I know that in the Baltics are particularly concerned about that for good reason. So it's something we pay attention to. Our officers are well tuned to it. When I visited Poland last year, we had good discussions with our troops on the ground as to what they're seeing, and being very cognizant of what they do and how they act and what they may hear and see, and making sure that we're countering that in every possible way.
Let's talk about the logistics.
Okay.
At the end of the day, without logistics, it's just a parade, which I think is a great line that logisticians like to use. I thought I'd get a better laugh with that, but obviously
very lethal
not.
parade, though.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But amateurs talk tactics, whereas professionals talk logistics. During the Cold War, we had forward resupply areas. There was a lot of investment. The Army could repair a lot of its gear. We've outsourced a lot of that capability, whether it's for feeding or servicing weapons and systems. We now, and oftentimes, good logistics is a deterrent. If your adversary thinks that you can't support yourself in the field, they go, hey, they've got a lot of stuff, but they're good till D+2, and then they run out of gas. And some of our allies want, for example, to buy weapon systems from us, but our stocks are so depleted that we're having a challenge even supporting them. And I know that there is almost a national level program to rebuild some of these stocks. But talk to us about how we need to think about logistics. You mentioned it in your address. In a highly contested battle space where you're going to be under fire, you're going to be under area denial fires, you're not going to have those areas to fall back to repair, regenerate. It's not clear whether we have enough sea lift or airlift for the job. Talk to us, not just from an Army perspective, but with your sister services, how you guys are thinking about this problem, because it's as key to deterrence as it is whether or not you've got a new tank or a new jet or a 1,000-mile cannon.
Sure. So it gets back to getting outside the enemy's range with regard to either their aircraft or long-range artillery. We do put a lot of effort and thought into that. We obviously have pre-positioned stocks around the world. We've bolstered them in Europe to put additional capabilities in. We train as we deploy our ABCTs to Poland and to Europe to deploy and then to draw from those stocks, to do so as rapidly as possible. We're also putting a lot of investment into building, for example, autonomous systems that don't require a lot of soldiers, that you can run supplies or materiel from point to point. And the key is, as I said in my remarks, mobility will be essential on the battlefield. Mobility and reducing your EW signature, if you will, to maintain survivability. So we're thinking through carefully as much as we can. We also want to make sure we reduce the tether of energy, of fuel that exists out there. So we're thinking through all that very carefully to make sure we understand what's going to be the best way to fight to survive. And alternatively, we got to look at what they can do or cannot do logistically.
Do we need to do a better job? Because during the Cold War, standardization was very important. How do we minimize supply lines? We went from our ammunition to NATO standards so that everybody would be using the same stuff, 9mm, 5.56, 7.62. Mod Deuce managed to survive that revolution, and we'll see whether or not it can have its next centenary in service. But does the Army need to do a better job standardizing? Because right now, during especially the last 18 years, the non-standard systems, the proliferation of different vehicles, causes real logistics and support headaches that you can handle if you're in an uncontested space. How important is it that these next 6 systems have far greater standardization, and even what role the Army can play with its allies in the Pacific and Europe to standardize on systems to reduce that logistics load, given that lives will be lost in those supply trains?
It's always a balance between standardization or uniformity and making sure you have the right capabilities, the right mix to do certain things. And so we have a range of vehicles out there. We'll have a variety of helicopters, but they all have to fulfill a certain mission. Now, to the degree within those systems that we can build standardization, all the better. A good example is we have the Bradley fighting vehicle, but we're going to soon be producing the AMPV, the armored multi-purpose vehicle, which is built on a Bradley chassis. So we have standardization there, for example.
And the howitzer uses the same chassis as well.
That's right, and extended range cannon artillery, which will be a great capability that we should see come out, range of over 70 kilometers, come out in the next few years as well. Again, we're looking for functionality, but to the degree we can build standardization, and all the better. And obviously, we want to ensure we, as much as possible, have interoperability with our allies when it comes not just to the warfighting side, but also with the logistical side.
You mentioned digging out of the budget hole.
Mm-hmm.
Unless they take your shovels away, right? I mean, Washington is a very contested space. We've seen a government shutdown associated with wall funding. Wall funding has, the president used unobligated military construction funds in an emergency declaration to do that. But some members of Congress in a bipartisan fashion are disappointed with that, so they want to limit unobligated funding. I think it's going to go, or they're proposing, from $9 billion to about 1 point something. Then we've got the whole equities fight between the White House and Congress over executive power. And there's a fight brewing at the OK Corral, and sometimes bystanders get shot. So how do you see this playing out? Do you think that there's going to be continued support, and that the Pentagon budget won't, once again, as was the case with the Budget Control Act, end up becoming a casualty at a time when you and all military leaders are making clear we need sustained long-term investment to solve this problem, not just a couple of years of up and a flattening, or worse, coming down?
Yeah. So the fact is, I know there is bipartisan support from the defense committees for the Army and all the services to have predictable, consistent, timely funding. It's there. They recognize the challenges we face. And then it's our responsibility to be good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars, which is why the Army undertook a number of reform efforts and over 750 specific activities to make sure we make the best use of the money we have, because the country faces bigger fiscal challenges before it. So making good use of every single dollar to make sure we can maintain readiness and balance that against future readiness is critical. So, but on the Hill, there's great support. It's getting above that at the leadership level to make sure that we get those adequate top lines, and that tends to get worked out again between the White House and congressional leaders, which I'm making a distinction between the defense committees.
Let me ask you about acquisition programs. The Army obviously has stood up Futures Command as an effort to get the requirements piece of it right. I have a follow-up question on this because there look like there's some challenges on that front, and want to get your thoughts into how to make the Army can make that the success that it envisions in. But on future vertical lift, the Army's helicopter programs, there is a little bit of a concern that the Army is sliding back into unclear priorities, that the program was set, so folks started investing hundreds of millions of dollars in their own money because they thought capability set 3 was going to be the first one. Mm-hmm. Full disclosure, Bill is one of the sponsors of our organization, but so is L3. Talk to us a little bit about, and then the capability set 1 for attack and reconnaissance now has been moved forward. So there's a sense that capability set 3 had sort of a 6-year advantage to deliver an aircraft where guys have actually developed prototypes and are flying them. Now capability set 1 is in play, a 4-year requirement to get that into service, which folks think might be a little unrealistic. And now you've raised a question about the Chinook, where you prominently said, I don't want to spend $20 million more for 4,000 pounds. The other side of that argument is, well, there is no Cape Set 4 requirement now, and that that Block 2 Chinook is what's critical to do battlefield lift to move M777s, for example, and heavy vehicles, and also includes, right, a 10-year maintenance interval you didn't do on those airplanes. Talk to us about, how do you address those concerns when people come to you and say, look, the Army's now went from having a priorities list, we were addressing that priorities list, and now you're changing the priorities list on us, which makes it hard for us to invest.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised by that. We've been very clear on our priorities. And I meet with CEOs all the time, and they agree that we've been very clear on our priorities. Long-range precision fires, next-generation combat vehicle, future vertical lift, integrated air and missile defense, the network, and soldier lethality. Very clear. 31 programs associated with that. And a lot of folks say, well, what's changed? And you've had a couple examples. We had a big change called the National Defense Strategy. It came out about 15 months ago, January of last year. And that changed a number of things. Now, fortunately, the Army was ahead of that, and we were largely aligned. But the National Defense Strategy, which is what is reshaping, has reshaped our thinking. So, and by the way, those 6 priorities I outlined, we have not changed those now in 24 months. Maybe the first time ever we haven't changed our priorities, but we haven't changed them and are not going to change them, at least as long as I'm secretary. So we try to be very clear, give predictability to industry and to others about where we're going and what those priorities are. Now, with regard to future vertical lift, I've said on record, General McConville, our senior aviator, said is the most important capability we need right now is the future attack reconnaissance aircraft. Regardless of who's ahead or behind, it's the most important. Why? Because we don't have an aircraft built and dedicated to that function right now. And in the future fight against the Russians and Chinese, we are going to need an aircraft that can penetrate and survive in a defensive system that has robust air defenses. So I need that capability first. Second is future long-range assault aircraft. We're not going to hold back one or the other if one is ready or not. But what I feel I owe industry is clear prioritization, and that's the clear prioritization. With regard to the Chinook, the same things apply. We do know we need an aircraft in the future that can fight and win and survive against robust air defenses, something that has sufficient speed and range and payload and survivability, all those things. Is the Chinook? I don't know. Is it a Block 2 or a Block 4 or 5 or 6? I don't know. But we do have a robust rotorcraft industry base, and my challenge to them is to go out and start thinking about what future heavy vertical lift looks like. It's not going to happen anytime soon, but I'm trying to tell them where we're going. I'm trying to be very clear so folks know where to put their brain power within their companies to start thinking about this, so that they can get ahead of us in terms of where we need to be.
And before I open it up to the floor, one follow on that. Payload, not as much payload as you need is a little bit like having a boat that has too much draft and you're trying to go into shallow water. Like if you don't have it, you don't have it, and it becomes kind of a problem. From your standpoint, is it a problem to not have that Block 2 Chinook in large numbers out there, given it's the only airplane that's going to be able to carry your future howitzer, your JLTV, some of your air defense batteries, and also, more importantly, since the Chinook serves as that real key element of battlefield logistics, especially at a time when you're moving under fire, can you afford not having that extra 2 tons of lift?
Yes, it's very simple, because the Block 1 can carry the 777, and for limited distances can cover the JLTV and can carry other aircraft. We're not going to be doing air assaults, at least the way we did it in 1991 with the 101st Airborne Division against Russian and Chinese air defenses. So I know that argument's out there. It's not accurate. We've talked a lot about this. We know what we need the aircraft for and when we need them. And so we're very confident that in terms of how we envision a fight, what we need to do. We have other vehicles, if we need to airlift into a fight that can provide us the capability we need in the first few days of conflict. And then as traditional air assault operations tell you, you ground convoy heavier things. That's been in our doctrine for a number of years.
Are you convinced, though, that in this kind of an environment that, as you said, it's easier to start a program than to kill it? Do you think that there's an atmosphere in Washington where if you go in with the leadership and say, look, here's the intellectual case and we've just got to pull the plug on this, that you can actually do that without being given more Chinooks whether you like them or not?
Yes, I think for the most part, as we talk to lawmakers, they understand what we're doing. They understand why. I think the biggest concern is the industrial base, and we got We have to work with all of our partners, just not for this program or others, to make sure we understand the impacts to the industrial base. But I think on the Hill, in bipartisan fashion, they understand what we need to do and why we need to do it. And transitions are hard. We get that. Transitions are always very hard. But I think our call to the companies out there, to the industrial base, is to, again, go to where we're going. Help us get to the future. Don't hold on to the past, because at some point in time, the program's going to end. And it's somebody, what inevitably happens is somebody comes up with a better capability than somebody else in the industry, and that is a lot more attractive, provides more capability, and they win. And it's just the nature of it. And it's always happened. I mean, if that weren't the case, we'd still be riding horses. We'd still have blacksmiths in the Army, right? We'd still be doing all those things we did.
A buggy whip industrial base.
We'd still have the old Jeep that I learned to drive on. We'd still have all these other things. But the fact is we have to prepare for the future fight. And change is hard. It always is. That's one of the challenges. Sometimes when you talk about armies fighting the last war and losing, it's because they didn't change. Either up here, that critical 6 inches, and this part that drives how do you modernize the force, how you re-equip it, so forth and so on.
I still maintain a Jeep is the best thing to learn to drive a stick on. All right. Okay, first question right there. Please state your name and your affiliation, and no soliloquies, questions.
Sharon Bovat, Win-Win Strategic Solutions. I was just in Korea, and you could feel the tension of China kind of breathing down North Korea's neck. And then we have this issue where we have the Venezuela and Chinese doing cargo ships. And our Army is desperately needed now more than ever. Yet when I talk to the average people, they think we can cut the budget. They think that we really don't need this stuff. So I just would love it if we could have a forum, and maybe you can expand on this, to educate the Americans, especially during the election year, why we need a bigger, a stronger Army, and maybe go out prime time. You, sir, can you respond to that? Because I've been to North Korea, I've been to India, I travel, and I see the threats, and I see that the Chinese are getting involved, and we're getting these proxy wars. What can we do to educate Americans like you've educated the people here today?
So thank you for that. That is why I'm here today. That's why I was at the Meridian Center a week and a half ago. I was at Brookings 2 months ago, is to go out and talk about what we need and why we need it. I can't speak more passionately about the urgency of the need for the United States Army to reform. We are using equipment now that is 40, 50, and in some cases 60 years old. We can't fight and beat the Russians with what we have today. It's that simple. Maybe today, but not in 2030. And look, if you want to get me a spot on primetime TV, help me out. My press person's back there somewhere. We'll work it, and I wouldn't hesitate to go out and say the same thing. The bigger challenge we have out there, because we'll get over the humps of re-equipping the force and modernizing the doctrine. The biggest thing is we need to, not all the services and all of our elected leaders, talk about the importance of service and young men and women considering the United States military as a viable option for the future. Because a country of 330 million people, 71% of them are unqualified to serve in one way, shape, or form. Less than 4% are even qualified and have a proclivity to serve. That's my biggest concern strategically, is getting the qualified, quality young people in to serve and to man our ranks in the years ahead.
Sir. State your name and your affiliation, please.
Ted Cummings, Salesforce. This is related to that question. It's been, and this is under soldier lethality, I would say this category is. It's been said culture eats strategy for breakfast. In the current divisive domestic culture we're in, the Army comes from. How will the Army develop the propensity of young adults, in concrete terms, to consider military service, and a propensity to stay in the fight that it may be called to discharge? And are they related? Do you have the capacity to do that direct communication, which I'm glad you asked about, because we have the means now to communicate directly to the public. We don't need to go through certain channels like we did in the past. Thank you.
Sure. So, the Army does operate in a marketplace. We made that change in 1973 with the all-volunteer force, and we have to compete with all the other opportunities and incentives that young people face, and which is very challenging in an economy now that is the best since 1969 in terms of employment rate. That's what we're up against. And yet we're still on track to meet our numbers. And I do think it's a challenge, as I noted. You know, in the wake of last year, what the Army did is we completely overhauled our recruiting apparatus. So we put hundreds of new recruiters out there on the streets. We changed and or moved our storefronts. We went much more deeply into social media. We're doing much like you would do on a political campaign, individual, going out to find young folks directly. We've put money out there for recruiters as incentives. We've put more money out there for young people. Again, the challenge, I think, is we can do all that, but the biggest influencers are still a young person's family and parents. You know, I was up yesterday at Bowie State commissioning 10 brand new lieutenants at that fine school, and I think most of the kids, when they came up on stage to take their photos, they were joined by their father or their mother who was prior military service. And as I go around, last summer I was at Fort Knox with the ROTC kids, and I was having lunch with them, and I said, how many of you come from a military family? I think 90% of them raised their hands. So the problem is young people today don't have the familiarity that maybe a previous generations did with aunts or uncles that served in the Korean War or World War II or even Vietnam. That's the challenge we face. And so there's a lot of mythology out there about service as well. So probably the biggest thing we're trying to do is go back into America's 22 largest cities and go to the kids where they are. So I've been to Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Atlanta and LA, Seattle. I've been all around the country talking to governors and mayors and school boards to get us access to the schools. Let us talk about all the opportunity we have in the military, whether it's a good paying job, job skills. We'll teach you about loyalty and duty and service and showing up for work on time. You'll get $4,000 a year in tuition assistance. You can get a bonus of up to $40,000. And you can spend an entire career or just come in for 3 years, either way. But we got to reach out to those kids where they are and tell them that there's a lot of opportunities in military service. And I'll tell you one thing, too, on a personal note. And I say this to the young people everywhere I see them. The friends you meet in the military and the time you serve will be the best ones you ever had. It'll be the best memories of your life. And you can't replace that. But we need folks, the influencers, if you will, to go out and tell that story.
Question right here. And then
Which place in the world?
please identify.
Sergey Greshko, BBC. So could you tell me, please, which place in the world or which area could potentially become a new point of conflict of interest between the United States and Russia, in your opinion?
Which points in the world? The most immediate?
I think so, yeah.
Well, I think the eastern flank, right? We're probably concerned with our allies in the Baltics and Poland. I just met earlier today with the Polish ambassador, in fact, and we had this conversation. So that would be one that would come to mind. Obviously, we have an ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and American forces, because I've been there, are actually training Ukrainians in Western Ukraine. But it's probably that part. It's where the seam is between Russia and our alliance partners, because we have an Article 5 commitment to defend our allies, and we're committed to doing that.
Sir?
Wes Walters with Saab. I have a two-part question. The first one,
I get to pick which one I want to answer. That's
Okay.
good. Go ahead.
I think they're related. So the first one is related to, we're hearing about how we're behind Russia and Chinese on modernization. The recurring theme I hear from the Army, which is a good one, is that it's not just a technology, but how you integrate it into the whole war-fighting capability, which it sounds like you're doing. So my first question was, how do you think we're doing as far as closing that gap with Russia and China? And then the second part related to that is that even though we may be behind on certain aspects of modernization, we're a battle-tested army, very experienced leadership, great soldiers, innovative. And I think that's an advantage we have over China. Russia has had some excursions, but I think our experience adds to that. So how does that fit into the analysis of not only the modernization, but the operational aspect of evaluating how we fight against the
Yeah, I do
peers?
think they both are related. So I can't think of anybody that does it better than the U.S. military, and I may be wrong. So at the combined arms level, just the Army, we work all the time fighting with infantry and armor and Army helicopters and integrating electronic warfare. That's number one. Number two, I think we work very well as a joint force, then integrating the Air Force and the Navy, and particularly the Air Force because we've had the longest relationship. Doesn't mean we want them back, Vago. I mean, I'll take them. We have our uniforms. Our new uniforms are better looking. So we do that well. And then I think also as a coalition. We fight well as a coalition with our allies and partners all the time. We're doing it now in Afghanistan. We've done it in Iraq. In my war, the Gulf War, we had many countries that we trained, that we fought that war with. And we train all the time with our allies. So I've been out to the JMRC, which is in Hohenfels, Germany. I've been out there a few times now to visit training, and I've been there when Polish troops were there, and Romanian troops, and Greek troops. And it's just something we do by nature, and it builds the interoperability and readiness that we need to deter conflict and then win if necessary. And by the way, we're doing the same thing in Asia, right? Training alongside in Korea with our ROC partners. So we need to continue to do that. We're committed to doing that. That's why when I talked about our exercise program, it's focused on doing those things because we have something that the Russians and Chinese don't have. Good allies, very capable allies, and we have to leverage them, continue to train, and modernize together so that we remain, a very capable force that deters conflict to begin with.
Let me take any questions from the line. Let me go to the back because we've stayed to the front of the room and haven't engaged anybody from the back.
Thank you. Alex Sanchez, James Defense. Quick question, Mr. Secretary. Can you talk a little bit about the National Guard's partnership program? New York just signed a partnership with Brazil, I believe. Colombia has a strong relationship with the South Carolina National Guard. I think Maryland just carried out exercise in Estonia, I think yesterday or 2 days ago. So what do you think is the future of these National Guard partnerships? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great program. We have our National Guard has partners all around the world, from Africa to Europe and Asia. And in some cases, some states have multiple partners. And so it's a great program. Both sides get a lot out of it. And to the degree we can expand it, I think it makes sense to do so.
We've got about a minute left, a little more than a minute. And I just want to ask one question, one lighthearted question, but one serious question. There's a lot of conversation, obviously.
Is this the lighthearted one or the serious one?
This is the serious one. The lighthearted one you'll see.
I just want to be ready.
The administration has wanted to unwind as much as possible from Afghanistan, Iraq. The president, or Syria, and the president's made that very clear. And some of the national security team have said, look, the importance is getting re-engaged in this great power competition and not be distracted from it. Bridge Colby was among the voices who was prominent on the national defense strategy to be like, hey, let's get our head in the big game. But there's a lot of discussion whether or not there could be 35,000 troops to a mission in Venezuela, for example, or 120,000 in Iran. Is there anything about the planning that you're doing for any of these scenarios that you would be able to share with us? And more broadly, would an engagement like that internationally derail us from the progress that we're making in this kind of a great power mindset and focus that we've been building over the last couple of years?
Well, I think the military, all the services plan and prepare all the time, so there's nothing unusual there. But we are focused on, making sure we build readiness, build capability to deal with a Russia or China, a major threat. And as other things come along, we got to be prepared to deal with them, whether it's Venezuela or Iran or North Korea or something like that. So it's just the nature of the business we're in, and we're constantly preparing and planning to meet those needs.
So walking and chewing gum would be something that we can hope that we can start doing again, right?
Sure.
Because for a while we sort of forgot that as we were focused in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the lighthearted question is, I observed that you were a distinguished graduate from the United States Military Academy class of 1986. So there was a long drought in Army football, and Army has been riding high. So I want to just get your take. How do you think the Army season is going to look like?
We're going to win again. We will win the Commander's Cup again, and so I'm very confident about that.
You are. So you're going to best both Air Force and
Yes,
Navy
for
in the only two games that really matter.
Absolutely, again, for the next 3 years. As long as I'm Secretary.
Secretary Mark Esper, Dr. Esper, it's always an honor
Thank
and
you.
pleasure. Thank you
Thanks,
for
Barbara.
joining us today.